Ali, Salma Abdikadir, Sarah Gassadeh, Sigal Hersey, Saddam Badawa. On June 16th of 2023, these 5 young women between the ages of 17 and 20 lost their lives due to the act of another that was shockingly reckless, incredibly selfish, and unspeakably foolish. One moment they were here, enjoying good times with friends, getting ready for a wedding the following day, and the next moment they were gone. They did not attend the wedding that following day, nor would they ever attend a wedding of their own. Some of them missed high school and college graduations. All of them had their futures stolen away in an instant. So what is it that could have taken so much so suddenly? What could have killed these 5 women who were just getting their adult lives underway? The cause of these deaths and all of the pain and the suffering that followed is present here in this courtroom today. His name is Derrick Thompson. He's sitting right there, and he's the defendant in this case. He killed all 5 women. He did so by taking a 6,000-pound Cadillac Escalade and driving it at extreme speeds while swerving from one lane to another on 35W. He exited 35W, swerving across lanes of traffic and still going over 100 miles per hour. He maintained speeds close to 100 miles per hour as he flew across 2nd Avenue and passed the speed limit sign indicating a 20 mile per hour speed limit. He disregarded all vehicles on the road. He entered the intersection with Lake Street by running what was clearly a red light at almost 90 miles per hour. The 5 young women were in a Honda Civic sedan, and they were just entering the same intersection from Lake Street, which had a green light. They never stood a chance. The defendant T-boned the Honda Civic. What resulted isn't sufficiently described as a crash or a collision. It was an explosion. The Honda Civic was damaged beyond all recognition. No one from that vehicle could have survived, and no one did. Right after the crash, the defendant got out of his vehicle and almost immediately fled from the area without even checking to see if anyone was hurt. He was located nearby shortly after and was detained while police investigated the crash. He lied about not being involved in the crash. He lied about where his injuries came from. And he complained to officers that by holding him, that by detaining him during this period, they were ruining his Friday night plans. During this trial, you'll hear from some of the family members of those 5 victims, and you'll learn that the defendant ruined much, much more than the fun things he had planned this Friday night. He ended the lives of 5 young women and brought about a devastating wave of shock, pain, and grief for 5 families who will never be the same. Now, this vehicle crash was captured on multiple surveillance cameras. You'll see a fair amount of video evidence during this trial, which will include video of the crash itself. I want to play one of those videos for you right now so that you know exactly what we're talking about. Shortly, you're going to see a vehicle coming onto the screen from the bottom right. The defendant has been charged with 15 separate counts in this case. There are 3 different counts associated with each of the 5 victims, and that's how we get to the number 15. You heard Judge Lamas read the charges in this case. But these charges are so much more than just numbers and technical legal language. These represent real human beings. They're real people who had lives and dreams for the future. So I want to talk about these charges, but as I do so, I want to show you the people that we're talking about. As I said, for each victim, there are 3 counts. 1 count is for murder in the 3rd degree. 1 count is for criminal vehicular homicide for driving in a grossly negligent way. And 1 count is for criminal vehicular homicide for fleeing the scene of an accident. You're going to hear a lot more about those charges and the elements that make them up later on in the trial. But for now, I want to point out counts 1 through 3 involve Sarah Escalade, who's pictured here with her mother. Counts 4 through 6 involve Siham Adawa, pictured here with her sister. Counts 7 through 9 involve Salma Abdi Kadir, pictured here with her mother. Counts 10 through 12, Segal Hersey, pictured here with her father about a week and a half before the crash. And counts 13 through 14, Sabrina Ali, pictured here with her sister. As you heard from the judge, the state in this case is represented by 3 attorneys. That includes myself and my colleagues, Paige Starkey and James Hanneman. This trial is our opportunity to prove this case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. We're going to do that by introducing 2 different types of evidence. The first type of evidence is witness testimony. It's going to come from people who will walk into this courtroom, they'll sit down at the witness stand right there, and they'll tell you about their personal observations. They'll tell you about the things that they saw, that they heard, that they felt, and that they did. That is evidence when it comes from somebody sitting there on the witness stand. The second type of evidence is more typically what we think about when we hear the word evidence. It's exhibits. It's things like maps and videos. Once all of this evidence has been presented, my colleague, Paige Starkey, will stand before you just like I am now, and she'll talk to you about the evidence in this case and how it's applied to the law that Judge Lamas is going to provide to you later on in this trial. So what is the evidence in this case? What are you going to hear about? Well, during this trial, I expect that you'll learn that Sabrine, Salma, Sarah, Segal, and Siam were all friends, and that they met up with each other on the evening of June 16th, 2023, to hang out and to get ready for a wedding that they had scheduled the next day. Some of them were getting henna tattoos done. Others were making sure that their wedding outfits were ready to go for the wedding. The 5 of them finished up their shopping and got into Sarah's Honda Civic. The plan was for Sarah to drop each of them off at their respective homes, but none of them made it home. While the young women were getting ready for the wedding, the defendant was at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. He was dropped off by his brother at the Hertz rental car airport location where he rented a black Cadillac Escalade. He's seen clearly on surveillance video driving away from the facility in the Escalade with no other occupants. He then makes his way from the airport and eventually onto Highway 35W headed north. So as we're looking at this map here projected on the screen, we have the airport kind of off the screen or off the image southwest. The defendant makes his way onto 35W, travels north into South Minneapolis. At some point as he was driving north on 35W, a Minnesota State trooper by the name of Trooper Guerra observed the defendant traveling at a speed that was obviously above the 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. As Trooper Guerra followed behind the defendant, he began driving even faster, and he started swerving through traffic. This driving behavior is captured on surveillance video and video from Trooper Guerra's squad cam, which you will see. Trooper Guerra continued to follow the defendant, but didn't activate his emergency lights yet. The defendant swerved from the far left lane all the way across all lanes of traffic in order to suddenly take the exit onto 2nd Avenue South. The speed limit there dropped down to just 20 miles per hour. Just before he exited the highway, a group of cars had slowed down at the red light at the bottom of the exit ramp. Simply out of blind luck, that light turned green just before the defendant was exiting onto 2nd Avenue. So that lineup of cars was able to move forward through the green light and essentially get out of the way. The defendant blew through that green light, swerved around parked cars and moving cars, and continued on towards the Lake Street intersection. At that next intersection, there was a red light, and those cars that had moved through the area were slowing down and stopping at that light. But the defendant did not slow down or stop at that light. He went around the cars. He blew through the red light. The explosive collision that you saw in that video moments ago occurred right at the intersection of 2nd Avenue South and East Lake Street. After the crash, as you saw, both vehicles were launched north of the intersection and rolled end over end. The defendant crawled out of the Escalade right in front of the home of a woman named Dorinda Pacheco. You'll hear from her during this trial. Her home is at 2937 2nd Avenue South. The defendant limped south on 2nd Avenue, but as Trooper Guerra approached the crash scene with his emergency lights now activated, the defendant turned and hurried off in the opposite direction. Ms. Pacheco watched as the defendant walked right past her, cut through the neighbor's yard, and went around the back into the alleyway behind those homes. Ms. Pacheco then went over to her back deck around the side of her house, and she watched as the defendant walked southbound through the alley towards the McDonald's. She lost sight of him as he entered the McDonald's parking lot from that alleyway. After that, the defendant was seen by another witness, this witness named Muhammad Muhammad. Mr. Muhammad had witnessed the crash from inside of his own vehicle, just a few car lengths behind the Honda Civic. He knew that something horrific had happened, and his instinct was to take out his phone and to just start recording. So as he did so, he drove through the intersection, turned around, and came back down East Lake Street towards the McDonald's and the Taco Bell. His phone continued to record as the defendant walked out of the McDonald's parking lot and right at Muhammad Muhammad's car. The defendant asked Mr. Muhammad if he could have a ride to get out of there. Mr. Muhammad said, "No, I don't think so. I can't give you a ride." And the defendant then walked right past Mr. Muhammad's car and into the Taco Bell parking lot across the street. That interaction was captured on cell phone video, and you're going to see that video during this trial. Now, as the defendant was actively leaving the scene of this horrible, horrible crash and trying to get a ride away from the area, law enforcement began showing up in numbers. Some approached the Honda Civic with the 5 women inside. It was quickly determined that all 5 women had already passed away, and there was nothing that anyone could do to save them. Other officers and state troopers began scouring the area, trying to find the person responsible for this carnage. Ms. Pacheco got the attention of the police officers, and she pointed them in the direction of the McDonald's parking lot, the last place she saw him go. Mr. Muhammad happened to be in that McDonald's parking lot at the time, and he pointed the officers to the Taco Bell parking lot. Police followed these clues, and they located the defendant in the Taco Bell parking lot, sitting with 2 young women. You'll hear from one of those young ladies whose name is Carolyn Stauffer. She'll tell you that the defendant limped towards Miss Stauffer and her friend who were sitting at the curb eating their Taco Bell. They were just some of the pedestrians that were walking around in this area during the time of the defendant's incredibly dangerous driving. Miss Stauffer observed the defendant as he approached her to be drenched in sweat and limping. The defendant asked Ms. Stauffer if he could use her cell phone, and she let him do so. He then made a call and asked the person on the other end of the phone to come and pick him up from the Taco Bell parking lot. Ms. Stauffer indicated that the defendant seemed desperate to get out of the area. After the defendant made the phone call, he sat down and he stayed with Ms. Stauffer and her friend for 5 to 10 minutes. Police approached around that time frame, and as they approached, they noticed that the defendant had a cut on his forehead that was actively bleeding. They asked the defendant what happened. The defendant claimed it was an old injury from a time when he tripped and fell over and hit his head. This was an immediate red flag to officers because they could tell that this was obviously a new injury. He was still bleeding. The defendant also happened to match the description of the person that the police were looking for. At that point, the defendant was detained for further investigation. He complained about being detained, and he insisted that he should be released so that he could go and enjoy the rest of his Friday night. After that, Ms. Pacheco was brought over to the area to do what's called a show-up. This is an opportunity for her to observe the person and then tell police whether or not this was the guy that she saw getting out of the Cadillac Escalade. Ms. Pacheco saw the defendant, and she confirmed that he was the man she saw earlier in the evening. After the defendant's arrest, a sample of his blood was taken so that toxicology testing could be done to determine if he had any signs of alcohol or controlled substances in his blood. He tested negative for any signs of alcohol use, negative for any hard drugs like meth or fentanyl, but positive for THC and THC metabolites. Now, the defendant isn't charged with any driving under the influence offense, but you'll hear about how this evidence could affect the overall dangerousness of his driving behavior in general. While the manhunt for the defendant and the eventual show-up were happening, investigators with the Minneapolis Police Department, evidence technicians with the MPD Crime Lab, and a crash reconstruction specialist from the Minnesota State Patrol were all called in to gather additional evidence. Police quickly located a Hertz rental car agreement near the Escalade, showing that the defendant was the renter of the vehicle. Crime lab technicians processed the Escalade for fingerprints and swabbed various parts of the vehicle and various items inside the vehicle for DNA. Now, Trooper Christopher Geiger, the crash reconstruction expert, mapped the area using various tools. He photographed the scene. He prepared the vehicles to be towed to a police lot where the crash data could be extracted from the vehicle themselves. That vehicle crash data would be used along with other data to provide further insight and information about the speed of the vehicles at various points in time and the force of the collision as measured by the change in velocity. One of the primary takeaways from that reconstruction will be that in the seconds leading up to the crash, the defendant drove at least 70 miles per hour over the speed limit. He swerved around cars, he ran a red light, and he rammed directly into the Honda Civic, which entered the intersection on a green light. Now, crime lab technicians were able to identify a fingerprint found on the center dashboard of the Escalade and another on a cell phone that was plugged in and charging in the center console as being the defendant's fingerprints. 2 cell phones were recovered from the car and showed evidence that they were used by the defendant. DNA analysis indicates that the defendant's DNA was part of a DNA mixture on the driver's side door and on multiple items located in a bag on the passenger floorboards of the vehicle. You're also going to hear evidence during this trial that the defendant's brother, DeMarco, his DNA was possibly found in one location of the vehicle. But DeMarco was never seen inside of the vehicle, and it is an open question whether he ever even entered the vehicle at all. You'll hear some testimony from DNA and fingerprint experts who will tell you about the science behind these investigative tools and what they mean for purposes of this investigation. Near the end of this trial, you'll hear testimony from Sergeant David Ligneal, who was the primary investigator on this case. He'll talk about the steps that he and others took to track down additional evidence and to try to piece together exactly what happened that night. Now, we are expecting this trial to last into next week, as you've heard a few times now. You'll hear the testimony from the witnesses that I just talked about during that time, and also some other witnesses that I haven't talked about. You'll see surveillance video, police body cam video, squad cam video, photographs, maps, and more. What I've tried to do here in this opening is I've tried to lay out the evidence in kind of a linear way that makes sense from beginning to end. And ideally, that's how we could present witnesses as well. Unfortunately, what happens when you try to arrange for dozens and dozens of witnesses to come in and testify is that people have doctor's appointments and vacations and work commitments and other reasons why they can't be here at exactly the perfect time when we want them. So while we're going to do our best to present this case in a way that makes sense and that is linear and logical, there's a very good chance, an almost certainty, that we'll have to call some witnesses out of order. But at the end of this trial, Ms. Starkey is going to come up here in closing and she's going to piece together this evidence and apply it to the law. Now, during this closing argument, Ms. Starkey's going to discuss the evidence presented at trial. She's going to break down the various charges. She's going to analyze the individual elements that make up each offense. And just to foreshadow a little bit of that for you, a lot of what you're going to hear about during this trial and a lot of the elements that you'll have to analyze, it's going to come down to what was going on in the defendant's head before, during, and after the crash. In her closing, Ms. Starkey is going to talk to you about certain legal concepts, things like gross negligence, fleeing the scene, eminently dangerous, and indifference to the loss of life. And I'm not going to define those here, but that's something that you'll hear about later. For the time being, while you're hearing the evidence in this case, ask yourself, how dangerous were the defendant's actions? What was his mindset when he did the things that the evidence shows he did in this case? Did the defendant flee the scene of the crash? And did his actions demonstrate an indifference to the loss of human life that he caused? When Ms. Starkey is done giving her closing, she's going to ask you to follow the evidence. She's going to show you how that evidence proves each and every element of each and every charge beyond a reasonable doubt. And lastly, at the very end, she's going to ask that you find the defendant guilty for all of the crimes that he committed and for all of the devastation that he caused.